Bathsheba, entangled in the grave misstep of Israel's most celebrated king, was married to David and the mother of Solomon, the monarch of greatest prosperity described in the scriptures. Previously, she shared her life with Uriah. Bathsheba's journey is intertwined with that of a divinely cherished figure whose downfall is detailed in the scriptures. Her story is also the history of a transgression that, though hidden from human eyes, was fully visible to God. In the scriptures, Bathsheba is introduced as the daughter of Eliam and the granddaughter of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Her name suggests daughter of an oath, or seventh daughter, and in some texts she is referred to as Bathsheba, which translates to daughter of abundance. Before her encounter with David, she was the wife of Uriah, a Hittite warrior in the army of Israel. The scriptures are silent about the personal details of Bathsheba and Uriah, leaving a veil over the nature of their relationship. What is known is that, on a day fated by destiny, Bathsheba was observed by David during a ritual of purification. At that time, Israel was at war. Uriah was on the front lines fighting for the country. David, despite his reputation as a military leader, did not participate in this conflict. Instead, he was in his palace, in a moment of idleness that paved the way for a nefarious act. It is here that Bathsheba's narrative takes on a tragic dimension. Observing from his terrace, David noticed Bathsheba bathing and was overtaken by desire. After inquiring about her, and despite knowing that Bathsheba was the daughter of one of his valiant warriors, the granddaughter of one of his chief counselors, and the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers, David decided to succumb to his impulses. Captivated by her beauty, he ordered her to be brought to the palace, where he consummated the act of adultery with her. Sometime after the incident, David discovered that Bathsheba was pregnant by him. Determined to conceal his fault, he devised a plan to make Uriah believe that the child Bathsheba was expecting was his. With this objective, he sent for Uriah to return from Jerusalem, hoping he would go home and spend time with Bathsheba, which would dispel any suspicion about the paternity of the child. However, Uriah refused to go home and be with his wife while his comrades fought. David even tried to intoxicate him, but Uriah remained resolute in his decision. Faced with Uriah's resistance, David sank deeper into sin, instructing that Uriah be placed on the front lines of the battle, where his death was almost certain, and indeed he died in combat. After Bathsheba's mourning period, David took her as his wife. At that moment, he might have believed he had covered up his transgressions and preserved both his reputation and Bathsheba's honor. However, everything was in sight of God, who disapproved of his actions. God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David with his sin through a parable that mirrored his own situation. Initially, David was outraged by the injustice portrayed in the story, not realizing it was a reflection of his own conduct. When he realized the truth, the king of Israel was deeply shaken. This narrative generates debates about the true role and guilt of Bathsheba in the incident. It is often questioned whether she was more a villain or a victim in this context. Throughout the centuries, theologians have debated intensely about what happened. While some argue that the location of Bathsheba's bath might not have been completely private, suggesting a possible imprudence on her part, this interpretation is controversial and lacks clear textual support. The discussion continues without a definitive answer, reflecting the complexity of human actions and their interpretations in the scriptures. The sight of Bathsheba washing by King David from his palace does not necessarily imply imprudence on her part. It is crucial to consider that David was in a raised position, providing him a unique perspective over the city, accessible only from the royal terrace. The beginning of chapter 11 of 2 Samuel highlights that the events occurred at a time when kings typically went off to war, suggesting that David was in a place where he traditionally should not have been. The biblical narrative does not suggest that Bathsheba was aware of David's presence in the palace, nor could she imagine that the royal terrace provided visibility to her place of purification. To attribute imprudence to Bathsheba in this situation is based more on conjecture than on textual evidence. Moreover, even if hypothetically Bathsheba had exposed herself imprudently, this in no way would justify David's action of taking her for himself. Some commentators go even further by suggesting that Bathsheba might have purposefully seduced the king, choosing to purify herself at a time or place visible to him. However, this interpretation also lacks solid biblical support. At no point does the text describe Bathsheba as someone who planned and managed to seduce the king. On the contrary, when God sends the prophet Nathan to confront David, the responsibility clearly falls on David, without any direct censure directed at Bathsheba. According to Mosaic law, consensual adultery was punishable by death, but there is no mention of such punishment for Bathsheba, reinforcing the perception of her non-active participation in the sin. In the parable used by Nathan to rebuke David, Bathsheba is compared to an innocent sheep, arbitrarily taken by someone more powerful. This, and the fact that it is subsequently stated that David took a woman who did not belong to him, indicates that the guilt lies entirely on him, not on Bathsheba. The discussion about the possibility of Bathsheba having a conditional divorce letter based on ancient Jewish traditions is intriguing. According to some of these traditions, it was common practice for men to leave conditional divorce letters with their wives when they went off to war, allowing them to remarry if they were killed in combat. This procedure was intended to facilitate the woman's life, enabling her to avoid the law of levirate, which required the widow to marry one of her brothers-in-law. Thus, the woman would not technically become a widow, but a divorcee at the time of her husband's death. However, applying this possibility to the case of Bathsheba and David is problematic. Even if such a divorce letter existed, Uriah was alive when David began his relationship with Bathsheba. The adultery occurred while Uriah was still the legitimate husband of Bathsheba, and it was David who subsequently ordered Uriah's death. The divine rebuke delivered by Nathan was directed at David not for involving himself with a technically available woman, but for usurping another man's wife in a dishonest and destructive manner. The biblical narrative clearly shows Bathsheba mourning Uriah's death, indicating her suffering and distress over the loss of her husband. This expression of grief contradicts any assumption that the episode could have been in any way desirable or beneficial to her. To claim that Bathsheba might have found some satisfaction in the situation due to her subsequent elevation to queen is to make a speculative and unjust reading of the biblical text, which provides no grounds for such an interpretation. Assessing Bathsheba's feelings and character without clear textual evidence is a form of judgment that is not supported in the scriptures, which portray Bathsheba not as a conspirator, but as a victim of circumstances and actions beyond her will. The interpretation of the events involving David and Bathsheba highlights an unequivocal use of power by David, who imposed himself over Bathsheba's marriage, Uriah's life, and even divine laws, which clearly condemn covetousness and corrupt actions. Notably, when David coveted Bathsheba, she was in compliance with the purification laws stipulated for women, demonstrating her adherence to legal prescriptions while David transgressed them. It is also important to note that although the biblical text does not suggest direct physical violence by David against Bathsheba, as is explicitly described in other biblical accounts using clear Hebrew terms for violence, such as in the case of Amnon and Tamar, this does not diminish the severity of David's abuse of power. The scenario implies a violation of another nature, the abuse of authority and coercion, elements that are intrinsically violent in a context of unequal power. Questions often raised about why Bathsheba did not resist or seek help are answered by the context in which she was placed. In a society where the king was the highest authority, there was no one for Bathsheba to appeal to. David was the supreme judge, the final decision-maker in legal and moral matters, placing Bathsheba in a position of extreme vulnerability. According to Deuteronomy 22, Mosaic law exempts a woman from guilt who is forced and unable to defend herself or seek help, reinforcing the idea that Bathsheba had no resources or support to resist an authority like the king's. Thus, Bathsheba was a victim of a power abuse by David, who used his leadership position not to protect but to subjugate. She was harmed by someone who should ensure justice and protection. This underlines the complexity and tragedy of the episode, highlighting power dynamics and the responsibility that leaders have to use their power for good, not for personal exploitation. The biblical account of David reflects the complexity of his character and the severity of his faults, showing that even venerated figures are susceptible to serious mistakes and detrimental consequences. David, as king, wielded his power absolutely, manipulating circumstances and people to achieve his personal desires. His series of commands, staying in the palace during the war, summoning Bathsheba to the palace, and orchestrating Uriah's death, illustrates a pattern of power abuse that was only interrupted when confronted by Nathan, a prophet whose loyalty was primarily to God, not to the human king. This episode highlights an important truth revealed in the Bible. It neither omits nor beautifies the mistakes of its main characters. Interpreting David as a victim or attributing malicious intentions to Bathsheba not only distorts the biblical text, but also attempts to justify actions that are clearly condemned by God. The Bible, on the contrary, does not hesitate to expose the flaws of its heroes, serving both as a mirror of their virtues and their failures. David distinguishes himself from Saul not only by his faults, but by his response when confronted with them. While Saul sought justifications, David showed deep repentance, as expressed in Psalm 51. Here, we see David pleading with God for mercy, fearing being rejected by God and losing the presence of the Holy Spirit due to his sin. The consequences of David's actions were severe and lasted for generations, affecting not only his personal life, but also the political stability of his kingdom. Ahithophel's rebellion against David, supporting Absalom in an attempt to usurp the throne, is interpreted by many scholars as revenge for David's actions against Bathsheba, reflecting the depth and reach of the impacts of his sins. David repented for what he had done and confessed to the prophet Nathan that he had sinned against the Lord. Nathan told him that God would take his son with Bathsheba. David pleaded, prayed, and fasted, yet his son became ill and died. After the death of their first son, the couple had 4 more children, including Solomon, who would become one of the wisest and most renowned kings of Israel. Despite being marked by sin and tragedy, David's lineage was also one of fulfilled promises and enduring hope, highlighting the complexity of divine grace and judgment. Bathsheba's story, besides revealing the complexities of sin and redemption, also shows how she played a crucial role in the political events of Israel. Solomon's rise to the throne, in particular, underscores Bathsheba's active role in the kingdom's politics. When Adonijah attempted to proclaim himself king, it was the joint action of Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan, and the priest Zadok that ensured Solomon was proclaimed the legitimate successor by David. This not only solidified Solomon's position as king, but also established Bathsheba as the queen mother, a figure of significant influence and respect in Israel. Bathsheba's legacy is further highlighted in the New Testament, where she is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. This fact is notable, as the genealogy does not omit her previous history with Uriah, underscoring the transparency with which the Bible treats its characters. Even in the most honorable lineages, human flaws are remembered, serving as a testimony to God's mercy and redemption. This element of the biblical narrative serves to remind us of a broader truth. God works through human imperfection. The story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, with all its layers of error, redemption, and divine grace, offers a powerful reflection on human nature and the sovereignty of God. It is a reminder that, regardless of our flaws and failures, God can and will use our lives to fulfill His divine purposes. It also challenges us to reflect on our own lives in the light of divine grace. Often, we may feel superior or more righteous than biblical figures like David, but the reality is that without God's grace, we are all flawed and dependent on His mercy. The story of Bathsheba and David, thus, teaches us not only about God's justice and forgiveness, but also about the humility we should maintain in our spiritual walk. Recognizing that our relationship with God and others should be guided by grace is essential to living according to the values He has set.